scroll to bring that spine near the white end, which is where it's supposed to be, if what you're photographing is white. Give that a try. When you come back from that track, it's time to move on to the next lecture, which is all about aperture and how that affects your depth of field. So, aperture and depth of field. Now, a lot of people think this is about the most confusing part in photography, but that's only because people insist on teaching it in a really stupid way. There's a very easy way to understand aperture, and it'll make perfect sense. And just a reminder that this is all covered in the aperture section of our course notes booklet as well, that you can buy online, and also the plastic summary flip cards. There's the aperture section there, which tells you which way to move your F numbers to what to get the field and all that kind of stuff as well. Pretty handy. So as we already saw in the basic lecture, aperture controls what's called your depth of field. And depth of field is just the amount of stuff that's in focus in front of and behind the point that you actually focus the camera on. So this is a very small or shallow depth of field. This one is a large depth of field, where much closer is still in focus and way into the distance is still sharp as well. So typically, if you're a portrait type photo where there's only one thing you're supposed to be looking at, your subject, you want the softest, blurriest background you can to make your subject stand out against a more 3D. So you want a small depth of field for that blurry background. In contrast to that, in a landscape, you actually want a big depth of field because the close-up plants and flowers and the distant mountains and clouds, everything is interesting and you want the viewer's eye to be able to travel everywhere in the scene. So for a landscape, you want a big depth of field. As we already saw in our basic photography lecture, using a bigger or a small depth of field to affect the background has a pretty significant impact on the photo. So here's a shot of a zebra using a fairly large. The zebra is kind of sharp, the background's kind of sharp. It all feels quite flat and stuck together, as opposed to using a smaller depth of field, where you can see now beautiful blurry background. The zebra just leaps out against that. You can see individual hair detail on the mane. So what actually is aperture? Well, inside your lens, it's this variable-sized hole, and you can just set that to be whatever size you want. It's defined to these things called
Ok.
or f-stops.
Bonsoir, bonsoir mes amis. comment nous y, mes amis? Je souhaite que nous en forme avec Jésus, que nous tout bien. Comment nous passer nous, comment nous et former nous y, comment petit nous y. Mettez quoi nous pour nan kay là. Ça cap fait comment former nous y. Merci en pile pour sou tellement très important pour moi la pino et que ou pas de problème. Fait marcher, ça cap fait.
Use a larger F, you get a larger depth of field. It's pretty straightforward. Now the actual range of F numbers you can roll to depends on the lens you have, but some of them will go up to numbers about f40-ish and down to about f something, from about 1 to 40. So this photo was taken at f2.8. So as far as F numbers go, that's a small F number, gives us a small depth of field, a small amount of stuff in focus. But if we used a bigger F number, like f22, that's a big F number, big depth of field, big amount of stuff in focus. Another example you can see here, this photo was taken at f2.8, so that's a small F number, small depth of field. You can see the background is blurry and just Jess is. If we used a large F number though, like f32, you can see the difference there. The back, everything is sharp in focus. The F numbers just scroll up or down on that depth of field. In focus, 2. If you wanted 10 Fs to be in focus, you'd pick F. If you wanted all 40 Fs to be in focus, you just pick F40. Basically, more things in focus, more Fs you want. Aperture doesn't get simpler than that. It really is quite easy. Aperture really is your most powerful tool for making your photos look much more professional. Using a small F number for a small depth of field is a really powerful way of directing the viewer's eye exactly where you want them to look. Like in this photo, you can't look anywhere else really. Your eye is just drawn straight to that one chess piece. What you want is incredibly useful. In a zoo, you might have cage mesh in front of what you're photographing. In the real world, you're going to have a bird deep in a tree somewhere, and there's little sticks in front of it, or there'll be bits of grass popping up in front of your lion. If you can actually focus carefully on your subject, though, and use a very small f number for a small depth of field, you can make your subject nice and sharp, but anything in front, like these little sticks, start to become blurry. And if you use a small enough f number, and you can get close enough to that thing you're trying to blur out, you can actually make it disappear. Look at this example. This mesh here is a 1 centimeter mesh. So there's no way I could hope to poke my camera through there and get a nice clean shot. But if I carefully focus on the cat inside there, that's a cat in there, and then use a small f number, then anything in front of the cat becomes blurry, and the cage wire, as you can see, has completely disappeared. That mesh you can see in the background there, that's the other side of the cage behind the cat. But there's literally 6 or 7 wires going across in front of its face, but you just can't see them because they've been blurred out. Pretty amazing. Another example, bird on a stick. So F22, that's a fairly big F number, big depth field. So the bird is sharp, the background leaves are quite distracting there, and obviously the chicken wire in front is really annoying. But if instead we just scroll down to a small F number, F5.6, take the same shot again, then the difference there. The background now a nice soft pastel kind of background, and the chicken wire's gone. Fantastic. And don't think that that is something you can do with really expensive, incredible lenses. I deliberately took that pair of photos with the cheapest, crappiest lens money can buy. But with really cheap, dodgy lenses, you can do amazing things with the depth of field. So you're supposed to be thinking now, before you take a photo, ask yourself the question, where do you want the viewer's eye to go in this photo? What are we supposed to be looking at? Is there only one thing of interest, one subject? Then you probably want a small f number for a small depth of field, nice blurry background to make it stand out. But if there are multiple things at different distances, like a then you want a big f number for a big depth field and make them all nice and sharp. Incidentally, if your camera has a landscape mode, basically that's just telling the camera to pick a larger f number for you so you get a larger depth of field. Or a portrait mode, that's just telling the camera to use a small f number, give us a bit of a smaller depth of field, nice blurry background. Now that's definitely better than auto mode, for sure, but it's nothing like as powerful as going over to aperture mode, like we're going to have a look at in a second, to really drag that f number exactly where we want. Because often, landscape mode doesn't pick a very big f number, it might pick about f7 or 8, whereas you could probably drag your f number all the way to f20 if you wanted to. So you can just get much more control and more exaggerated effects by going to aperture mode and telling the camera exactly what you want. It's worth realizing that the region of stuff that's nice and sharp is actually centered around the point that you focused on. Turns out that about 2/3 of the in-focus stuff is behind.
Anale Timoun, fè l'maché Timoun, kote nou Timoun, anale gen sel kara Timoun, non sel moun nan kara Timoun, e depous Timoun, anale, fè l'maché Timoun, anale.
So we're going to use a big F number.
Fè l'maché Timoun, anale Timoun, fè l'maché Timoun, anale Timoun. Côté nous Timoun, anale, fè l'maché Timoun.
So that depth of field is now wasted behind the mountains. Only 1/3 of it comes forward, and your foreground, the rocks, and pebbles and stuff, are still going to be out of focus. So the actual answer is, when you're photographing a landscape scene, you just aperture mode. So aperture mode on a Canon is AV, and for every other brand it's just called A. So in aperture mode, you can pick whatever aperture value you want, as long as that's
Anale Timoun, fè l'maché Timoun, anale Timoun.
So I actually stay on aperture mode almost all the time. This is typically how aperture mode that's quite different.
Ok, Salomon, merci beaucoup sur Salomon, merci en pile beaucoup pour Salomon, comment vous êtes, bienvenue pour Salomon, ça qu'a fait Salomon, comment nous y, gagne un seul moun nan kala Timoun, 3 pouces Timoun, gagne un seul moun nan kala Timoun, 3 pouces, ça qu'a fait, en aller Timoun.
Let's say you make the photo brighter, so you use your plus minus exposure compensation. In aperture mode, it's not allowed to open the hole up anymore because you're still saying the same F number, but somehow it's got to let more light in so your photo is brighter. So you'll just find that it leaves the shutter open for longer so more light comes in. Or if you ask for a darker photo,
Fel mache
it
ti
fast
moun.
the shutter speed for you, so there's not as much light going in. Basically, aperture mode, you pick your F number, it works out the shutter speed, so you end up with whatever exposure brightness you ask for. So looking here, obviously as we scroll our F number up bigger and bigger, getting a bigger depth of field, with the landscapes and so on, you're noticing the aperture hole is smaller. And then the shutter has to stay open longer and longer, so we still end up with that same correct exposure. That's something to be aware of. Really large F numbers, really small holes, they often end up requiring quite a long and slow photo, so you've got to hold the camera really steady.
Fel mache ti moun gen 3 moun nan kay la 3 pouce ti moun. An ale ti moun. An ale ti moun.
But they're using such a big F number for such an amazing depth of field that the photo is going to be quite slow. Going the other way then, scrolling smaller and smaller F numbers, getting smaller field, good for portraits, nice blurry backgrounds, and conveniently also nice fast photos at the same time. Just a point to note, don't expect to see the depth of field change when you're looking through your viewfinder. This will actually till you get the photo back that you'll see the depth of field. Because when you're looking through the viewfinder in a DSLR, in fact the lens stays open to the largest hole it can, so you can see. It wouldn't be much good if you'd asked for F22, which is a really small hole, and the lens just shut down. You wouldn't be able to see through the camera anymore. So in fact it stays open no matter what F number you ask for, until you actually take the shot, and then it briefly jumps down to a different size, takes the photo, then opens back up again.
An ale ti moun. Fel mache ti moun. An ale ti moun.
The other thing to remember is you're not entirely safe anymore in aperture mode. It won't stop you selecting an F number, even if there actually is no shutter speed to match up to it for that current light finish. Maybe it needs more than 30 seconds, or maybe it needs faster than 4,000 of a second limit that the camera can do. So you can pick whatever F number you want as long as the lens can do it, but there just might not be a fast enough or a slow enough shutter speed to match up to it. So you've got to be aware of that. The camera will warn you. It'll sit there flashing the F number at you, or it might go red, or the comments normally say high or low. There'll be some warning there letting you know that the F number you picked is basically out of range for the current light conditions. It'll sometimes happen in a situation like this. Let's say you're trying to take a photo in the dark, and you make it worse by using a large F number. Now when I say you're making it worse, that's because the large F number is a small hole. So there's already almost...
Fel mache ti moun. An ale gen 2 moun nan kay la ti moun. 4 pouce ti moun. An ale ti moun. Fel mache. Fel mache ti moun. Et petit bon Dieu, merci en pile pour poussou. Merci en pile pour poussou, petit bon Dieu. Fel mache. Bienvenue pour vous. Et ça travaille en aller. Fel mache.
So that's a bit the telltale. If you're looking at photos, you just seem to be getting inexplicable exposure.
Crazy.
I asked for it too bright, but it's not getting bright.
Explosion.
Probably was telling you that there was something warning you, something flashing at you, you just missed it. So just don't use such a large or such a small number until it's kind of calming down and doesn't have any flashing warnings at you. Another thing you can do to combat that is change your ISO. We'll leave that to you.
An ale. Fel mache ti moun. An ale. Fel mache.
It actually tends to make any point light source turn into a bit of a star. If a star burst, it can look really cool. Some people hate it, but I think if it's used properly, it can be quite nice. So to get that effect, you have the sun actually hiding behind the leaf of the building or whatever it is, while you half press and set the exposure and focus, all that kind of stuff. Because remember, if you have the sun already in the shot, it might throw out your picture and you'll end up with a silhouette. So you have the sun hidden, half press, and then just move to the side just until the sun just starts peeking over the corner of the building. Take the photo just before you go blind, basically.
An ale ti moun. Fel mache ti moun. An ale.
Very wide. If you look at the sun for a long time, you actually risk going blind. It's like looking at it through a telescope. You just burn a hole in the back of your head. So try not to do that. Alright, so it's time to go out to your aperture crack, which is actually a pretty straightforward crack. Just pick up the camera, make sure you're on aperture mode, AV mode or A mode, and then you just want to find a subject and take 2 different pictures of it, one with the big F number, one with the small F number. Compare the two, and you should be able to see the background blur out in one of them and become sort of sharper and more distracting than the other one. Look at these two photos. Which one of these has the smaller F number? Smaller depth of field? Definitely it's this one. In fact, the closer you get to your subject and the further away the background is, and the more you zoom your lens in, that'll all help to give you a nice blurry background. If you're really not able to see any difference between your big F number and your small F number shot, just probably get closer or find something that's not so many different things that are similar distance away. Get closer. You'll get there in the end. You should be able to see a fairly dramatic difference. Another common problem you might have with this crack is if you're using a large F number, so the big depth of field, you expect the whole thing to be nice and sharp. But you might actually have a problem where the big F number makes your photo so slow that you get camera shake. In fact, the whole thing goes blurry just from subject movement and camera shake. Nothing to do with the F number. So if you're getting camera shake problems, then just turn your ISO up. Then come back in and look at the next lecture, which is exploring shutter speed in your photo. There's nothing like it's longer or it's bold.
Faire marcher, en aller, Timoun, en aller, faire marcher, Timoun, en aller.
And don't forget, this whole section is also covered in our course notes booklet that you can buy online, and also those little plastic summary clip cards as well. The section there of, using shutter speed to freeze or show movement and how you do all that kind of stuff. So what is shutter speed? Well, as you know, it's just how long a shutter is open for, how long the light is allowed to shine onto the sensor for. So if you use a very quick shutter speed, then nothing's had a chance to move anywhere while a photo is being recorded, so you end up being able to snap freezing quite fast subjects like these ones. It's worth noting that almost all of the cameras
Okay.
you know how to control it. And slow shutter speeds, on the other hand, show movement blur. So anything that's moving becomes streamed across the image. It can create some really beautiful effects. Incidentally, sports mode. If your camera has a sports mode, one of the things that sports mode tries to do is give you a nice fast shutter speed so that it has blurry people around. But the problem with all of the effects is that you can't change anything yourself. So sure, it might try and give you a fast shutter speed, but what if you wanted to brighten the photo with your exposure compensation or just use the autofocus point or something? You can't do any of that kind of stuff. There are incredibly limiting modes to be in. You may as well be in aperture or shutter speed mode over on the creative side, and you can do all of these things and more in any of these modes. Here's a photo of a waterfall taken in auto mode, and for whatever reason, the camera thought that 50th of a second would be about right. Now, 50th of a second is not particularly quick or particularly slow, so we haven't frozen the waterfall or shown that nice flowing movement. But if instead we ask for a 1 second photo, then now you can see that lovely flowing cascade effect that looks so beautiful in the waterfall. There's a lot of situations where showing a bit of movement in your photo can really just add a bit of life. If you take a fast photo of a helicopter, normally you end up with a really fast shutter speed and the blades are just frozen there in midair. It kind of looks like the engine's turned off. They should just be falling out of the sky. But if you allow just enough shutter speed for the blade to turn a little bit, this looks more natural and the engine's still going. Most low-light photography has to be quite long to close photos, just because it takes a long time for the camera to get enough light in there to record the image. But this is some of the most beautiful creative photos you can do. Like this one, 6 seconds. So obviously the camera has to be absolutely motionless, so ideally on a tripod, or at least sitting on a rock or something where you don't have to touch it. But not only does the camera have to be motionless, of course your subjects do as well. You can see actually she has moved, so she's blurry there. Good in, right? This one, 20 minutes, so now we're getting beyond the 30-second limit that the camera can do by itself. So to get this kind of shot, you've got to plug in some external timer. So after 20 minutes, obviously the Earth has started to rotate and the stars get dragged past the sky there and beginning to get a bit of a star trail. But it's cool to see the star trail is not actually a straight line, it's a bit of a curve. And if you work out where the center of that set of circles are, you get a photo like this one. So to work out where that point is, where all the stars are firing, in the northern hemisphere, it's a bit easier. There's a giant star there called the North Star, and if you can recognize that, easy. In the southern hemisphere though, it's a bit more complicated, but you can work it out from the Southern Cross. So if you find that constellation, and you just draw a line down through the middle of the Southern Cross, like a string coming down from the kite. And if you just extend the axes of the Southern Cross down by about 4.5 times the height of the Southern Cross, so you just kind of go, there it is, 1, 2, 3, 4, and a bit. That's the same point. That's where it's all spiraling. So you can put that somewhere, for good composition in your shot. And also, if you're lost and you're trying to work out where south is, find that point.
En aller, Timoun, faire marcher, Timoun, en aller.
So that might
En aller, Timoun, monter, Timoun, en aller, Timoun, fais le marché, fais le marché, fais le marché.
They're quite long, these tutorials, but it's just because I've worded them in a way that they're really easy to understand. And they don't assume any prior knowledge. So it goes through everything, like what lenses are you going to use, how do you focus because it's in the dark, what are the common problems you might come up against, like a flash, what are your different ways of being able to do it. You can do one really long exposure, or you can do a whole lot of short ones and then stitch them together using free software. There's a whole lot of different options out there. It's really worthwhile having a look at these free tutorials. So go to the website,
En aller, mes amours, gen yon sel moun nan kala Timoun, gen yon sel moun nan kala Zamim yo, gen 5 pour Timoun, en aller, Timoun, fais le marché, Timoun, monter, Timoun, engrangeant Timoun, monter, engrangeant Timoun nan kala Timoun, en aller, Timoun, en fait Timoun, en marché, en roun, Timoun, en aller.
This is our Christmas card photo a couple of years back. So there's no fancy Photoshop or anything going on here. It's just a 10-second photo with a flash at the end of it. So initially all the camera can see is just black, and then the sparkle is right, very Xmas, and then we stand to the side and then the flash goes off and fills us in there. Pretty cool what you can do with these kind of things. Well, this one, you can tie a light to a string and spin it around while you walk in a circle, and you end up with a light bulb. Looks pretty cool. You can draw pictures through space. You just use these little torches, draw shapes or symbols, and then the reflection there is because we're kind of on a wet beach. And if you haven't tried a photo like this one before, you really have great fun. It's actually steel wool. You wouldn't think steel wool would burn. It sort of smolders a little bit. But if you tie it onto a bit of string and spin it around, absolutely burn. And it just sends these beautiful shards of molten metal up in these wonderful arches. And it looks amazing. You've got to be careful though. There's a few tips you probably don't want to learn by trial and error. Like some of the bits of steel will get straight up in the air, come down in the air. So you might wear a hat. Best not to just tie the steel wool directly onto the string, because otherwise you'll find partway through, it just burns through. You just send this burning steel onto your native roof. It's not good. It's better off actually using a bulldog clip, clipping a bulldog clip onto the steel wool and tying the string onto the bulldog clip. Yeah, a few little tips like that might just save you a little bit of embarrassment. We also have a light painting tutorial on the website, and that just goes through all about how to take these long, slow exposures where you can draw things with the light, like the forms of drawing pictures on the steel wool. So you have a read through that as well and have some fun. Well, what about this photo of the glowing tent? Now, as much as NSR would like us to believe that tents are wonderfully warm, glowing havens, they're not. They're miserable, cold, horrible, wet, dark places. But to make it glow like that, you just got to do whatever you can do in 30 seconds with light. So I've actually just dived inside the door of the tent there. You can still see my legs hanging up. And the little white lines in there, that's just me waving the torch around, trying to give it an even spread of light from the inside. And the thing about all of these low light photos, you can't even begin to do them unless you have a tripod. I think that's the main reason why it's worth going and getting a tripod.
En aller, mes amours, comment nous y, Timoun, comment nous y, en aller. Ça cap fait. Zambi nou nan kala Timoun, en aller, Timoun. Monter nan kala, en aller, mes amours, en aller. Fais le marché, ça c'est tout, comment nous y.
Lock it, and then it's nice and quick. And all tripods have a load limit that they're designed to support. So you've got to make sure your tripod is strong enough to support your camera and your heaviest lens. But don't go and buy one that can support 10 times as much, because it's just too heavy and too expensive, and you'll never bring it with you anyway. Now, even if you've got a tripod, sometimes you'll find these exposures are still blurry. And normally what's happened there is you poke the camera. It's you pressing the button that started the whole thing wobbling. So you could use some fancy timer remote, so you can press it without bumping the camera, but you're better off just using the inbuilt self-timer you've got on your camera. You know that 10-second countdown, beep, 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 and then it takes a photo. If you're ever using your camera on a tripod, you may as well turn that delay on. It just means you can press the camera all you want, and it'll wobble a little bit, but after 10 seconds, it'll be perfectly still, and it'll take for you. Also, it's a good idea, if you're shooting on a tripod and you know everything is nice and stable, you should turn the stabilizer on your lens, because some stabilizers actually end up introducing camera shake if the camera is ready. So turn that off. Just remember to get options like these ones.
En aller, Timoun, fais le marché, Timoun, en aller, Timoun, fais le marché.
Rapid fire, continuous shooting, high-speed continuous, and that's when you hold your finger down and the camera just takes as many photos as all of them, and then go back and hopefully find the perfect moment. This one is the 10-second delay countdown timer, normally good for with your friends so you can run around and stand and be part of the photo, but as I said, it's also good for if your camera's on a tripod to keep it nice and steady so it's not wobbling anymore by the time it actually takes the photo. Funny story getting this photo though, up in the Arctic. So I didn't have any with me or anything. All I had was 10 seconds to run around from behind the camera, pick up my hiking pole, bring out the 2-second mode. This is actually 5 times less useful than the 10-second one, but I guess it's more useful for when the camera's on a tripod and you want to press the button for wave, the camera will stop after about 2 seconds. And yeah, I guess it's good for coastal exposures or something where you're photographing the wave go 10 seconds out when the wave's going to come, so 2 seconds is easier to use. But it's basically for when the camera's on the tripod. Some cameras have a self-timer continuous mode like this one. It looks like a variable time limit, but it's not. You still start at 10 seconds, but that's the number of photos it'll take after 10 seconds, normally with a 1-second gap between them. So that's useful in a situation like this where maybe Jess can hang on to the bikes, I can set the camera up, to go with it. It's just like the opposite of aperture mode. So you'd be using TV mode or S mode when particular shot is what's created with most important photo. So you really want to watch that the hole any smaller after a while. So as we ask for photos here, 6th of a second, 0.3 of a second, that seems to be okay. But if you're trying to go any further, you find the camera just can't shrink down that hole anymore, so it can't stop any extra light coming in. So then you're going to get into that same situation we saw in the aperture lecture, where it just starts flashing for the current lighting conditions. But it can stop you taking the picture. So if you really wanted to, you could scroll all the way to 30 seconds or something during the day, take a picture, and we'll try and warn you. But if you ignore those warnings, it'll just take a full 30-second photo for you, and it'll come back, and it'll just be massively overexposed. So just watch out for those flashing warnings again. And just a reminder, you can always get to the same photo, exactly the same settings, on any of these other modes, like aperture. It's just which variable is the same value. If you really want a particular shutter speed all the time, then you want to be in shutter speed mode. The most important thing was to have a particular F number the whole time for a certain depth of field, then you stay in aperture mode. So some cool tricks with longer shutter speeds, the panning shot is good one to practice. That's where you want to show movement in the subject, but rather than holding the camera steady and having a long shutter speed and letting your animal or whatever it is move past, because that would be Instead, you can actually follow the subject with the lens as it goes past, and if you can keep your subject in exactly the same part of the photo,
Fais le marché, ça c'est tout, fais le marché, ça c'est tout. On allait, comment nous y, fais le marché.
10th of a second or 20th of a second. So that's still fairly slow. And then just look through and follow it as it comes along. When the animal or the car is right perpendicular in front of you, you should end up with a pretty cool result. It's just practice. You'll get a lot better in the couple of times. The zooming in shot, trying to while you were taking the picture. Kind of weird? Yeah, it is kind of cool. A waterfall or a fountain. So then set your camera up on a tripod and then wake it up. That's an important step. You've got to always remember to wake up your camera so that it's alert and looking at the lighting out there and stuff. Otherwise you wouldn't know if it was trying to flash warnings at you or not. And then try and scroll down to the slowest shutter speed you can. So you wake up, scroll slower and slower speed, and eventually you'll get so slow that it'll start to flash warnings at you. So then come back one, and then it should calm down. That's the longest, slowest photo you can take. So go ahead and take that one, click, and you probably see that shows the movement in the fountain or the waterfall or the car going past. That'll show movement blur. And then take the same photo again, but now with fast shutter speed. So you'd wake it up, and then go the other way. And then finally, it'll get too fast, it'll flash warnings at you, come back a bit, okay? Then that's the fastest photo you can take in that situation. So take it, and you should find that the movement has been frozen, or at least less movement has occurred. Now, because we haven't really covered ISO yet, that's in the next lecture coming up. For now, just put your ISO 400, that'll be fine. Okay, we better have a look at ISO and how that all fits together. And just a reminder, there's an ISO section in the booklet that goes with this course, as well as a little summary set of plastic clip cards. Got a handy little reference there if you ever forget any of these key tips. So ISO is basically a variable setting for how sensitive your camera is to light. It needs to collect a closed photo. As 100, that's a fairly low, unsensitive. That means it needs to collect an awful lot of light to be able to get you a picture. Or you could crank your ISO right up to 1600, several thousand, and then it's very sensitive. It doesn't need much light at all. Even a little brief amount of quite faint light, and the photo's already finished and give you a correct exposure. There's all kinds of ways people make themselves confused about ISO, what it is and how you use it. Basically, this is the simplest way to understand ISO. The higher you turn your ISO, the more sensitive your camera is to light, so it doesn't need to collect so much light anymore to give you exactly the same picture. So instead of having to leave the shutter open for ages and collect this huge amount of light, even just the first little bit of light coming in is enough, the shutter finishes, and that means you're able to get faster shutter speeds than you otherwise could. Now that's a real advantage, to be able to have faster shutter speeds than you otherwise could, particularly in low light, when it's just too long and slow, and you end up with a lot of camera shake and you get blurry photos. Even if you have your camera on a tripod, your subjects are still moving around, so they're still blurry. Whereas if you have a fast photo, great, you can handhold it, no one's moved anywhere, and that's great. Or even just for extra fast photos during the day, like if you're trying to freeze a bird in flight, maybe the fastest photo you could normally take would be about 500th a second. That's pretty quick, but it's not quick enough to freeze the wingtips on a bird. So if you turned your ISO up, you might then be able to take 1,000th of a second and absolutely freeze wings. It's the same thing if you think about it. Turning the ISO up would be faster shutter speeds than you otherwise could, either in low light or just because we want an even faster. A little example. I wanted to try and freeze these water droplets, so with a fast shutter speed. But because it was early morning, there wasn't much light around. The quickest photo I was able to take was only 20th of a second. Now when I say that was the quickest photo I could take, if I was in P, program mode, then that means all I could scroll to was 20th of a second and it wouldn't let me scroll any further. Or if I was in shutter speed mode, that means I could happily scroll to 20th of a second, but if I tried to go any faster, like 50th of a second or 100th of a second, it would have just set the flashing warnings at me saying no, and I would have had to have come back anyway. So no matter what, I couldn't get a faster photo than 20th of a second. But if I crank my ISO up to ISO 1600, then all of a sudden I'm able to scroll all the way to a second to get that creative effect I wanted to freeze the water droplets. But it's important to realize that other than that, the photos look the same. It's just by turning your ISO up, you can get away with faster shutter speeds. Now if you crank your ISO too high, you do have the downside of losing a little bit of quality in your image. It's called ISO noise. The same thing used to happen with film, due to a totally different reason, but it looked similar. When you zoom right in on the image, you see it looks a bit gritty and grainy. You get these kind of random speckles of colour. Now this is nothing like as big a problem as people make it out to be. You really only see ISO noise if you zoom really a long way in, or if you blow the picture up really huge. Let's take a look at a series of photos taken of the same patch of blue sky at different ISO levels. And you can start to see, the higher you crank your ISO, the more we're starting to get these random speckles of colour. And this technology is getting better and better all the time. The example is the Canon 5D Mark II, that's ancient in terms of cameras. So the same example again, now with a 1D Mark IV. So even that's a good couple of years old. And now you can see the ISO is much better. Unfortunately, you still have people going around saying, oh no, don't turn your ISO up more than about 800, it'll be unusably noisy. It's just completely not true. These days you can crank your ISO to ridiculous values, and it basically unlocks photos that were previously not even possible. I'd much rather have a little bit of speckly noise in my photo because I've used a bit too high ISO than not having used high enough ISO and end up with the shutter speed being too long and slow and have a blurry subject. A blurry subject is really obvious and it ruins the shot. Having a little bit of ISO noise, it's not the end of the world, and in fact post-production is getting better and better to kind of smooth out that anyway. Let's zoom out this photo. This is the example photo of the really ancient camera, the 5D2, at the 12,800 ISO, which was the worst that camera was prepared to offer us. And by the time you zoom all the way out, it looks nice. If it was a full-frame photo of a bird, that would be fine. So I actually err on the side of safety by having slightly too high ISO than too low. Now all this has been about turning your ISO up to help you get faster photos, but the reverse is also true. If you wanted to slow your shutter speed down and get really long, slow photos with lots of flying movement in there, it helps to turn your ISO down. So if you dropped your ISO down to ISO 100, something like that, you'll find you might be able to access much longer, slower shutter speeds than you could before. So the take-home point for ISO, if you like, is basically to treat it as an extension tool for your shutter speed. It's something you can completely forget about and ignore, really, until you find yourself going, gee, I just can't get a fast enough photo. The bird's wings are still blurry or whatever it is. Then, turn your ISO up. Then you'll be able to access much faster photos than you could before. Or if you're like, I wanted to get a slower photo than I seem to be able to get. I want a longer photo for more movement blur. Then drop your ISO, and you might find you'll be able to access much longer, slower photos. But to avoid noise, the idea is just to keep your ISO as low as you can. There's not much point having your ISO super high and getting really fast photos if you didn't need to, because you're also going to get that little bit of noise quality loss. So that's it really for ISO. You've already covered aperture and shutter speed, and together those three things form what's called the exposure triangle. They're the three variables you can control to affect the way the light ends up in your photo. Is how long the shutter is open for, how long the light is coming in for. Your aperture is the size of the hole, so how much light is coming in. And then your ISO is basically how much light it needs. So by varying all of those three things, you've got complete control over it. Now before we go out and practice ISO, I just want to touch on a couple of other camera modes, things like manual mode. Now unfortunately there's a real misnomer around with manual mode in that people think unless you're shooting on manual mode, you're somehow not getting the full creative control out of your camera. That's just completely not true. Values like aperture mode, shutter speed mode, they're still giving you complete control. You can still get to every setting you could imagine. You've still got exposure compensation, so you can still get the photo brighter or darker. A lot of people think you need to go to manual mode for that. In manual mode, you've got to do everything yourself. You've got to pick your own aperture, your own shutter speed, your own ISO, and it doesn't help you match them up. So if the lighting changes or if the scene changes, you just end up with incorrectly exposed photos all the time unless you're forever watching that little light meter and balancing all these values and juggling them around. Now manual mode is useful in situations like in a studio. You set your values up once and you don't want anything to change depending on different subjects moving in front. Or complex flash work, you don't want your camera manual mode has a use. But normally out in the real world, running around where the lighting's changing and that kind of stuff, it's just slowing you right down. Bold mode is another mode that's worth looking at. This is how you can get beyond that 30-second limit and start taking longer, 2-hour star trail photos. If you don't have a bold mode, don't worry, it'll be hiding inside your manual mode. So in bold mode, you can pick whatever aperture you want, but then with your shutter speed, it's determined by how long you leave your finger on the shutter button for. So you can actually hold your finger on there for an hour and get an hour star trail photo. Obviously you'd introduce a lot of camera shake and your finger would get a bit sore. So that's when you're actually designed to plug in one of these external timers. So that's the same as pressing the button on the camera, and that's the same as leaving your finger on the button, and then you can turn it off. Now if you don't have one of these fancy timers, that's alright. On our safaris, we go out to these beautiful places where the sky is super dark and the stars are so rich, everyone wants to take star trail photos. Not everyone has those timers, but you can still experiment just by, you need to find a way to hold that button in without hanging onto the camera. The best way is just to hold it in with a bunch of rubber bands. You might need to put a little stick and just, that'll hold the button in there, and then you can step away and the camera starts taking the picture. You come back an hour later. I don't think about the ratios involved. If it's taking a whole hour for that faint light to register in your picture, the last 100th of a second of wobble isn't going to make any difference. Obviously it's more convenient to have a fancy timer, and you can get one eventually, but just to start with, it's good to know that you could go out tonight and take a star trail photo just to see if you like that kind of thing. So for our prac session on ISO, you should test out how it affects both aperture mode and shutter speed mode. Start off in aperture mode, and then just pick whatever F number you want, and then look at the shutter speed that the camera is going to use. Either take a picture and look at it, or just look through the viewfinder, touch the shutter button, and just look at the shutter speed it's suggesting there. Let's say it was going to use 50th of a second. Fine, if you turn your ISO up, you find the shutter speed it's going to use is quicker. So if you doubled your ISO, it's going to double your shutter speed. So that's convenient. If you ever remember when we were taking the large F number photos and they were quite slow, a lot of camera shake involved, if you crank your ISO up, you'd find then the shutter speed becomes faster again, and you'd be able to handhold it without that camera shake. Changing your ISO in shutter speed mode just affects the range of shutter speed values you're allowed to operate within. So, let's say if you're in shutter speed mode, so TV or S mode, you wake your camera up, and you try and scroll and find the fastest photo you can get to. It might be 500th of a second or something before it starts flashing warnings, so you come back a bit. But if you turned your ISO up, you'd then be able to keep scrolling to much faster shutter speeds, 2/4,000th of a second. Or if you wanted to get longer, slower photos, initially you kind of scroll down and you go, the slowest I can get is 50th of a second or something. But if you drop your ISO all the way down, like ISO 100, then you might find you could scroll to an even slower shutter speed, 20th of a second or 1 second or something like that. The same thing's actually happening in both situations if you think about it. By turning your ISO up, we're either able to get to faster shutter speeds in shutter speed mode, or in aperture mode it's automatically picking faster shutter speeds for us. And if you turn the ISO down in shutter speed mode, you can get to slower photos, you just still need to scroll there. But in aperture mode, turn your ISO down, it'll automatically pick slower photos for you. Now what about auto ISO? A lot of people ask about that. Now, auto ISO in shutter speed mode, TV or S mode, that's actually quite handy, because then the ISO will only ever lift up just enough so you can get whatever shutter speed you're after. But auto ISO in aperture mode is actually not that good, because all it ever does is lift your ISO enough that you're getting enough shutter speed not to have camera shake. That's basically all it's trying to do. So it's giving you a quick enough photo that you're not shaking around. Often it's nothing like quick enough to be able to freeze the animal or the bird or the person walking around. You still end up with blurry photos. So I don't use auto ISO for aperture mode, but I use it quite a lot in time value mode, shutter speed mode. So after the session, make sure you come back and find the next lecture in the series, which is on lighting. There's so much you can learn about lighting, just the simple stuff like the different types of lighting and the different directions of lighting, how that affect your photos. It's a really powerful thing to know. So in this lecture, we're going to look at lighting. Now I know that sounds like a fairly broad topic, but at least being able to understand the different types of lighting and the different directions of lighting and how that affects your photos and flash and things like that, that'll put you a lot further forward in what you can get out of your photos. And just a reminder that in the course notes booklet as well, there's the same lighting section that matches up, and with the little summary clip cards, there's a section there that tells you about the directions of lighting, which way that puts your shadows and so on. So that's pretty handy. But in many ways, lighting is probably the most important part in photography, really. You can do as much as you want with your aperture and shutter speed and blah blah blah, but if the lighting is terrible, there's almost nothing you can do to get a good photo. Let's just look at the various types of lighting you get in your average day, starting with lovely golden morning lighting. Now, as you know, morning lighting is beautiful for photography. The sun is low in the sky, so it's nice and soft. You don't have that contrast problem. The shadows are not too dark, and it has that nice to it as well. It's a really beautiful time for taking photos. While you can certainly take beautiful photos before the sun comes up as well, you've got about an hour afterwards. That's what they call the golden hour, when the lighting is just perfect. After that, pretty rapidly the sun starts to climb higher and get stronger, and you end up with harsh lighting. When the sun gets too strong, then you end up with contrast problems. So the bit in the sun is a million times brighter than the bit in the shade next to it, so the shadow just becomes jet black, or you end up blowing out your highlights, they become too bright. It's just not a good time for taking photos. Also, middle of the day, the sun is quite high, so you end up with top lighting, which means you get shadows in the eye sockets of people, and photographs of animals and things. They kind of become very bright on the top and very dark underneath. It's not a very nice direction of light either. Not a good time for taking photos. If you have to take photos in the middle of the day in the sun, you're better off going and finding some shade. Literally going and standing behind a building or something where it's just total shade lighting. Because the light that gets into the shade is actually really beautiful. You don't have any contrast problems because you're already in the shade, so there's not going to be any shaded side of your subject. It's just nice and even. It's the same with cloud lighting. If you wake up and it's just a blanket cloud cover day, you might think, oh, what a boring day for taking photos. Sure, your landscape photos might look a little drab if there's too many clouds, but photographs of things like people and animals, fantastic. Cloud lighting is beautiful. It's just such a soft light, and the light has bounced off from everywhere, so it's coming from every direction at once, so it fills every little nook and cranny evenly. It's a very flattering kind of light for portraits. Wrinkles and things don't really show up. It's a great time for taking photos, and it means you can shoot all day long because there's never any harsh sunlight. Here's a good little tip. If you're photographing an animal that's sitting in the sun, like a little crab or a lizard or something, if you could actually shade it with your body, sort of move yourself between the sun and your subject, cast your shadow over it, then you've got it in nice soft shade lighting and it'll look beautiful. All the colours will look nicer and it won't be so contrasty anymore. Moving on then, you get to evening lighting, much like morning lighting I guess. The sun is low in the sky and you get that nice warm orange glow again, and the contrast problem is not there anymore. You can see in this photo, you can see the shadows, but they're not too dark at all. They just provide a bit of interest. It makes it look a little bit more 3D. You can still see into the deep crevices in the rock. And obviously this photo is taken with a large f number. You can tell from the large depth of field, so everything is in focus, but also the sun has done that starburst, which remember in the aperture lecture, you get that with the large f number. And finally moving on to low lighting. Now, low lighting is tricky to deal with just because there's not much light around, and it's going to take the camera quite a long time to collect enough of it to give you an image. So you're going to have to expect to have quite long, slow shutter speeds, so you're going to have to hold the camera really steady, or put it on a tripod, or turn your ISO up, or a few other things. It's a little trickier to deal with, but it's worth persevering because you can get really beautiful results. Don't always let your flash pop up. It's worth knowing that in all the camera modes we've been using on this course, so program mode and everything better than that, the flash will never pop up on its own. If you actually want to use the flash, you have to press the little flash release button next to the flash, and then it'll pop up. But if you leave it down, then you're forcing the camera to use that natural ambient light, and you can get such beautiful results. All of these sort of photos would have just been ruined in auto mode. The flash would have popped up, bam, and you'd lose all that delicate lighting of the fire or the head torch, whatever it is. So persevere. So the other important factor of the lighting is not only the quality of the light, but the direction that it's completely illuminated. So you don't have any shadows on it, of course, because if you're shining the light on the front of it, all the shadows are around the back. So it's great if you want to be able to see every detail, like for a product photo, for a catalogue or something. There's a lot of drawbacks to front lighting. If your subject is at all reflective or glossy, the light just sort of shines straight back into the camera and you get that nasty glare. Same on the skin of people, or if they're wearing glasses, or if you're trying to shoot through glass, it just bounces back at you, so it's not that nice. And the worst thing about front lighting is it tends to make your photos quite flat and two-dimensional. You can't really see the shape of things. You need some shadows for that, and that's where side lighting comes in. So side lighting reveals shape and texture through the shadows. So side lighting is good for portraits, or anything where you just want to make it look a little bit more 3D. Now, backlighting, when you're starting out in photography, people often try and avoid it because you end up with dark silhouettes and things like you saw in the exposure lecture, when you accidentally have the girl in front of the window, or if you get the sun in the background, and your subject just comes out as this really dark figure. But in that exposure lecture, we learned how to fix those kind of problems using exposure compensation. So you could just go +2, brighten the photo back up, and then great. So after you've learned how to deal with the problems of backlighting, it can give you some really beautiful results. It can give you a nice glow or halo around the edges of things. Rim lighting can give you really nice silhouettes. And for people, it gives you nice highlights in the hair. So backlighting can be a really beautiful light to use. You might just find you need to overexpose the shot sometimes. And you've also got to look out for lens flare. You've probably seen these little splashes of light that come across your photo from time to time. That's caused by direct sunlight coming into the front of your lens and reflecting off every bit of glass inside your lens. Now, getting direct sunlight in your lens is a problem for several reasons. Not only do you get lens flares, but you also lose some of the saturation of your colours. And if you have little bits of dust or something on your lens, they tend to show up more. Autofocus can struggle. Getting sunlight in your lens is not a good thing. Now, if the sun is actually in your photo, then you're going to get sunlight on the front of your lens, clearly. There's not much you can do about that. So you probably have lens flares and all the other problems. But often the sun is not in your shot. Maybe it's up here somewhere. You wouldn't have even really thought about it maybe. You wouldn't think it's backlit at all. But in fact, the sun can still see directly into the lens. So we're getting direct sunlight spilling across the front of the lens, and we're still getting all those problems. So that's what these things are for. Lens hood. Their whole point in life is just to shade the front of the lens, so you don't have lens flares, so you get to keep your nice rich colours and so on. Now, most lenses come with lens hoods, and oftentimes people just tend to forget about them, or they just leave them on backwards all the time, which is a bit silly. That makes it smaller so you can put it into your camera bag, but every time you photograph, you really should get in the habit of getting it out and putting it on. It's almost never a problem. People think, oh, it's cutting out light and you might need that in low light or something. It's not true. It's only ever cutting out light that you don't need to photograph. It's just cutting out stray light coming in from the edge. The only times you might ever want to take it off is if you're doing really close-up flash work and you popped your little flash up and it couldn't quite see past the lens hood, so you end up with what's called a hood shadow on the bottom of your photo. Never doing you harm, and you should get in the habit of using it. So it's worth taking just a couple of seconds to think about lighting before you start taking photos. You know, if someone asks you to take their photo in the sun, realize that they're going to be really harsh shadows going somewhere in the shade. Or maybe if there's no shade, look up in the sky and you might find that the only reason it's harsh sunlight just now is that there's a hole in the clouds, but it looks like if you wait about 2 minutes, there's going to be a big bank of clouds roll in front of the sun, and then you'll be with nice cloud lighting. Totally worth waiting 2 minutes for some nice cloud lighting before you photograph someone. Or at least think about the direction of the light as well. Rather than having the sun over there and getting lens flares and things, maybe bring it around here and shoot from that way. Then you get some side lighting, it looks more 3D. It doesn't take long to think about these things, but it can make a really big difference in how your photos look. Look at this example of a little beetle on a leaf. You can see that's just fairly boring top lighting. But instead, if you turn the leaf up to the light and have the light coming through it, then you get beautiful colours coming through the leaf, and there's a real silhouette of the beetle, and it looks fantastic. Okay, let's take a look at flash. Definitely not just for nighttime use. In fact, I use my flash a lot more during the day than I ever do at night. Because if you use it during the day, you can fill in those harsh shadows caused by strong sunlight. This example is crying out for some fill flash. Look at those harsh shadows under the hat, and it's just all so contrasting. But if we just pop the flash up, take the same photo again, that looks much better. And the great thing is it doesn't even look flash, does it? It looks quite natural. If you take a flash photo at night, normally it looks pretty flash. During the day, you can just slip some light into the shadows there. When you're doing that, it's a technique called fill flash. And all of your cameras can do this, even your compact cameras, even your smartphone cameras. You can normally force your flash on. Now you could just try and lift up the overall exposure until your subject was nice and bright, but by then the background would be completely blown out. Popping your flash up, throwing some light in there, and filling in those shadows to being the same brightness as the background, and then it all looks great. You can also use your flash to add a little glint or a sparkle into the eyes of people or animals. It's called a catch light. It makes a big difference, just brings them to life a bit more. It doesn't have to be a flash, you just need to be able to see the reflection of something quite bright in their eyes. It could just be a window or something like that, but a flash is an easy way to try. So maybe in the last of the bad photos you've taken, pop your flash up, just see the effect you get. Okay, we better have a look as to why on earth you'd buy one of these giant external flashes if you already have a little inbuilt or pop-up flash in your camera. Most people just assume it's because these are obviously bigger, more powerful, you can penetrate the dark further. That's true, but that's actually not the main reason you'd buy one of these. It's because of the amazing creative lighting options these kind of things open up to you. Because with the pop-up flash or an inbuilt flash, all you've ever been able to do is just harsh front lighting. And we saw before, there's nothing nice about harsh front lighting. You know, you get reflections and glare, and it makes your photos look very flat and two-dimensional. That's all you've ever been able to do before. But if you put one of these on instead, then instead of harsh front lighting, you turn it to the side and get bounce flash. You bounce it off a wall and it drifts back, and then you've got soft side lighting. Of course, you do need a wall or something to be able to reflect the flashlight off. Not much good being outside and turning the flash to the side and hoping you're going to get some light back. But in those situations, you just take the flash off the camera. You know, you connect it via a hot shoe extension cable, or a lot of flashes are wireless now, and that just lets you get the flash to the side a little bit to give you some side lighting, so your photos look more three-dimensional. Of course, it would be fairly harsh, because you've got a flash gun pointing straight at your subject, but what you can do in those situations then is just pull out a little flash diffuser, or in fact a lot of flashes, you can buy big external plastic diffusers, and they just make the light come from a softer, more gradual kind of area. And you just end up with more three-dimensional photos. Using flashes these days is just so easy. It used to be quite complicated. You have to learn about things like inverse square laws and guide ratios and that kind of stuff. But these days it just does it all for you. Modern ETTL flashes. In fact, when you take a picture, the flash actually sets off a little pre-flash first, and the camera looks at how bright that's made your subject, and then adjusts the power of the flash for the real photo. So you end up with exactly whatever brightness you've asked for on your flash exposure compensation. It's just so easy. Bounce flash, you just turn the camera to the side and take the photo again, and you'll still end up with the correct amount of light. Look at this example. So this is classically front flashed. Looks like a stunned rabbit and looks a bit two-dimensional. But now just turn the flash to the side, bounce it off a wall, and you get nice soft side lighting. It just looks so much nicer and more 3D. Let's look at white balance. White balance is about making your colors come out correctly, making things that are supposed to be white making them come out looking white, not slightly blue or slightly orange. It's quite a tricky thing that your camera's got to do for you, actually, because you're never photographing under pure white light with the entire spectrum in there. You know, most indoor lighting is a little bit orange, shade lighting is a little bit blue, and if you use the wrong white balance setting, your colors just come out a little bit off. Now, thankfully, all of our cameras have auto white balance, AWB, and honestly, that's the one you want to leave it set on almost all the time. Not only does it do a really good job at working out what kind of frequencies of light are out there and adjusting it properly, but the main thing is it'll remember to check it every single time. You know, you see people running around trying to set their own white balance, and most of the time they just forget, and you end up with photos with weird colors. But the reason you need to know about white balance is because eventually your photos might start looking like one of these. If you ever find yourself thinking, gee, there's something weird in the color department, color is a white balance problem. So go and check your white balance setting. You'll probably find you've just accidentally slipped off auto white balance and you're on shade or tungsten or something like that. Put it back on auto, it'll probably fix it right back up. If it doesn't, if you're literally on auto white balance and the colors are still weird, it's a pretty unusual situation. Maybe the camera got tricked because there were two types of light around or something. Then and only then would you bother going into your white balance setting and actually choosing one of those values. Tungsten, daylight, fluorescent, flash, cloudy, shade. And if none of them are right, there's even a custom white balance in a lot of cameras where you can just photograph something that's white and tell the camera to make that come out white, and then it'll correct it for that. But I've never even really had to use that. You can tweak your color later on in post-production as well. And if you're shooting a RAW file, it really doesn't matter. White balance is entirely an afterthought. You can choose it from a drop-down list later on. So don't worry about it. Just leave it in auto white balance most of the time, and that'll keep you out of trouble. Okay, let's take a look at filters now, starting with polarizing filters like this one. Now, polarizing filters, just like polarizing sunnies, they help to cut out glare and reflections and things like that, can make the sky look darker, richer blue, clouds look better. Leaves and things, leaves are quite waxy, and if you can get rid of the glare, you end up with the deeper, richer green leaves in landscapes. A cool bit of kit to have, particularly for your wide-angle lens. You've got to realize that a lot of people buy them and just and then forget about them. There's so many things wrong with leaving a polarizer on the end of your lens. It's not even funny. Firstly, you screw it on, but you'll find the actual polarizing filter then keeps spinning, and you've got to set that every time you're taking a picture, because as you twist it, you'll find all the reflections disappear, and then they come back again, and you've got to choose because the lighting's different in every situation. And the other reason why you shouldn't leave it on is because it does make the world quite dark out there, and your camera's forever going, gee, it's quite dark. The shutter will have to stay open longer to collect more light, so you end up with longer shutter speeds, more camera shake, or you'd have to turn your ISO up more. And also, every bit of glass you put in front of your lens, you're potentially reducing the quality of your lens. So you get what you pay for, particularly with polarizing filters, if you buy a really cheap one. So only put it on when you actually want to use it. But you can get really beautiful results. Have a look at this one. So here's a photo taken with and without the polarizer. When I say without, it is on there. I've just twisted it so there's not much effect happening. So you can still see all the reflection of the sky and the water, so it's hard to see into the water there. There's a bit of that white haze in the sky. But if we turn the polarizer visible, now have a look. All the reflection disappears on the water, so you can see straight in there. And you're left with a darker, richer blue sky, which looks great. Really cool bit of kit to have. But as I said, only put it on when you actually want to use it. As opposed to these filters, the clear UV filters, these ones should be on your camera all the time. Now, a UV filter, not surprisingly, filters out UV light. But actually, all of your digital cameras have a UV filter built into the sensor these days, so the fact that this is filtering out UV light too is a completely useless bonus. But the real reason why you should still all have one of these on is just because they protect the front of your lens. You know, the front of your lens is actually really delicate. It's got very fine anti-reflective coatings on them that are very easily scratched. And if you put your fingerprint on there, it's quite hard to clean the front surface of a lens. But if you put one of these things on there, not only are they very easy to clean, but they're pretty bulletproof. It's actually quite hard to damage your UV. Check it out, buy another one. They're replaceable. They're much cheaper than the front of your lens. But again, you get what you pay for with these things. So if you've spent a lot of money for a really nice sharp lens, spend a bit of extra money and get a good quality UV filter. Otherwise, you're just going to lose all that clarity again. So that's it for lighting. Next lecture is all about lenses. Good idea to have a bit of a handle on how you classify these things, you know, what you're paying for, what the different features are, what they do, and so on. So thanks very much for watching this one. I hope you enjoy the next one as well. Alright, lecture. We're going to look at lenses. There's obviously a million different types of lenses, and it's a good idea to have a bit of a handle on how you classify them, what the different types do, and so on. And just a reminder that there's a whole lens section in our course notes booklet as well that you can get online, as well as those plastic summary clip cards, little section there reminding you what you want to do. So lenses. Basically you can divide it into about 4 basic categories. Things called standard lenses, whatever they are, and then you've got wide-angle lenses, telephoto lenses, and the rest you can just safely sweep into the other category. They just do creative, interesting things. We'll look at that as well. But a standard lens just sees a similar view to the human eye. So that means if you put the camera up to your face, nothing seems to change when you're looking through the lens. It doesn't suddenly become looking through a telescope or looking really wide. It's just a normal sort of view. It's just a standard sort of shot. That's a standard lens. Angle lens obviously lets you fit in a wide situations like this, or just wish you could fit in more. For a landscape, and then you've probably all done this as well, where you take a photo of a little bird and it turns out like that. Whereas what you really wanted was a photo more like this one, which is like where you've got a telescope stuck on the end of the camera. So that's what a telephoto lens does. Like a telescope, it lets you zoom right in and see distant things and make them fill the frame. And those other lenses just do creative things, like a really detailed close-up photo of just the eye of this bird. Well, a macro lens will let you focus very close. You've still got to get very close. That's a pretty tame bird to get that close. The lens is pretty amazing. You can get really quite close to things and they still function, whereas most lenses have a minimum focus distance of quite a long way away. So you can get really close to even small things and make them look really big. So there's actually a whole world out there of amazing little detailed photos. You know, not only bugs and things like that, but you know, raindrops and reflections and textures and feather details. You know, you've already got a wide and fairly long lens. What are you going to buy next?
Cadê histoire ici?
A bit longer.
Eu já falei de machine. É como se machine,
But really, a macro lens will open up a whole new world that you've never been able to experiment with before. I really recommend doing that. And don't forget, they don't only focus up close. It's a normal lens in every other regard. You can focus a long way away as well. In fact, excellent portrait lenses, because normally macro lenses go down to a nice small f number, about f2.8. So that's great for portraits as well. Small f number, small depth of field, beautiful blurry backgrounds. They're a really nice lens to have. Other interesting creative lenses would be fisheye lenses. They just give you a really wide angle of almost 180 degrees. They kind of have a bit of a distortion or a bow on the horizon as well. Tilt shift lenses, there's all kinds of other lenses that just do creative things really. But really, it all depends on the angle of view that the lens can see. So if that was wide angle, that might be standard, and that might be telephoto. But the way you measure the angle on the lens is what's called the focal length. So if you pick up a lens, it'll have a measurement written on there. It might be 16 to 35 millimeters. And you'll sit there going, 16 to 30? What does that even relate to? Focal length is just a measure of how the light is focused inside the lens. You can see this is a 20 mil lens. This would be a 50 mil lens. And that would be 150, but you get the idea. The longer the focal length, the kind of narrower the field of view. The shorter the focal length, the wider the view.
Apa yang di chauffeur tête en bas, nous bagay, boy, bagay. Bon,